As a fellow artist, I've always admired Uncle Bill's work from afar, but the time seemed right now my own career has evolved, to see if he was up for some kind of collaboration in the form of a dialogue. My practice deals very much with the interactions between artists and the city and vice versa. I was really curious about Bill's thoughts about this subject matter and how he thought how the city had inspired his career. And I was interested in his ideas about space in all its forms: architectural space, public space, utopian space, the space that sculptures take up, etc. etc. I also wanted to inquire whether Bill's living in Studio North, a modernist building designed by Christopher Nicholson, who was inspired by the idealist Le Corbusier, reflected Bill's own ideas about idealized spaces, about utopian spaces. Studio North was built in 1933 as a studio for the artist Augustus John, and it's based in the New Forest. The first floor was the space used by John as a studio, and as such had a high ceiling, tall windows, and inbuilt window seats on which his models would have posed. And the first floor space leads out onto a large balcony that overlooks the garden and is reached by a spectacular spiral staircase. Most of the interviews took place in Bill's studio, which is off site. Here he is looking at a print by Leila Curtis, which is in his own collection. She's an artist in whom I'm also very interested because she deals with the psychogeography of maps and traveling and how public space is used and perceived.
So, I first maybe wanted to have some thoughts about how, as an artist, you think about space and how you construct space. And there is a French philosopher, Georges Perec, and he states that um, how space begins, that literally you start tracing signs on a blank page. So not only the sheet, it's like a physical a manifestation of space, but once you start writing on it, it becomes, it transfers, something like when you start mapping. So just to describe space is to name it and to trace it, like the map makers. In so I just have you got any thoughts about those? How you work with, how you see space as maybe as a, I don't know, could be a material, as a kind of.
I'm not sure that you see spaces. I think you experience them,
Yeah.
which obviously has sight is part of that, seeing things.
Yeah.
But the experience has to be multi-sensory
Yeah.
with all your senses.
Yeah.
You can experience in complete darkness you can experience a space because of the way sound sort of echoes or reverberates or works in a space. It will give you information about that. And obviously immediate space you can touch the boundaries of it if it has boundaries.
Yeah.
Generally your feet are on one aspect of the space. Unless you're an astronaut, you're floating in it, and that's when I'm working in two dimensions. On a flat plane, I'm drawing or I'm painting or something. I'm also working in a three-dimensional way inside my head.
Yeah.
It might not be in the immediate beginning, it might not be a conscious thing, but you're having to be aware of that at some point, of what you're creating and what it looks like. But, I mean, the difference between walking in New York and walking in London, for example, is incredibly different. You know, in New York, you're just walking in straight lines on a grid system, which a lot of American cities are built on. And in one way, it's very easy to navigate that, because you're either going north-south or east-west, or a combination of the two. Whereas in London, I mean, you could be going in any direction, and you can't determine that direction easily. You can't determine that direction easily. Obviously, these days, there are electronic means which enable you to do it without thinking, basically. But you would have had to have some sort of knowledge beforehand.
Living and working in a big city in London, do you think that had an effect on your art practice? Or do you think if you had lived and worked somewhere else in another city, would that have changed your work?
The difference, I've worked in lots of different cities around the world, and they are all different to a certain extent. But the main difference is they produce different materials, and the example that I've used, which is the easiest sort of way to understand it from my work, my early work anyway, was that the steel components of American cars were much thicker and heavier than European cars, and much more difficult to work with because they were thick. They were like tanks. Whereas Italian cars, being much smaller, and some French ones, their metal doors or hoods or whatever were almost like paper compared to that. And that reflected the sort of environment they were in. You know, Italian cars had to be very small because the streets in cities are very narrow, etc., etc. You know, so they're just things like that.
You haven't placed a lot of artworks in a city environment, but then there was the fourth plinth. I mean, that was mega. But are you? Can you think of any more examples?
Well, in an exterior environment, I mean, you mentioned the British Library.
Yes. Yeah.
Sitting on history.
Yeah.
There is also another cast of that in the King's Road, sort of on a larger paved area, just off the normal pavement. But what's interesting, I think, about some of these things, they're not. The actual space where sculptures end up is quite often not the artist's choice. A space is determined for something by a committee or whatever, or other people, or somebody buys the work and then they decide, oh, I'd like to put it here. So
actually, that's an aspect I hadn't thought about.
Yeah.
It's actually out of your hands, really.
Quite often, you don't. Nobody's very rarely comes to you and says, look, here's the whole of the city, where would you like to put a piece of sculpture?
Yeah.
There are sculptors who would approach a city and say, I'd like to put my work here. But that doesn't, I don't think that comes off that often. What does the artist want from putting their own work in a public space? And I think that's quite a tricky one to answer. Do they want glorification, fame and fortune? Do they want people to experience the work in the way that they've made it, or i.e. to think in the same way as the artist was thinking? Do they want to discover things about that particular work that they never knew before because people respond to it? That's actually one of the areas that interests me most, because I do discover stuff that I've never even thought about when other people interact with the work, because they see it totally differently. That's always quite exciting, actually.
An utopian city, so it wouldn't better a city just to fill it with random artworks. An utopian city is not a city with lots of public artworks, so that would make
public
people
artwork.
happy.
Public artworks don't make a utopian city. I mean, you've only got to look at cities where dictatorships are. Which is not utopia.
You live in a building which was designed by Christopher Nicholson, who was inspired by the idealist Le Corbusier. Does this reflect your own ideas about idealized spaces? I mean, we can talk about this here or at the house.
No, that's fine. I hadn't lived in a building like that before we moved to this one, and now I think that I would find it difficult to live in a different sort of building, different sort of architecture, because of the light and the space and how it works as a house, as a home. And it makes me look at the homes that are being built, or the architecture for homes that new homes that are being built, and I find that architecture is very disappointing and is not geared towards giving people somewhere to live that will uplift them every day and make them feel great and good. I mean, it'll give them a home, but they need space. They need space, more, and things that just an environment that is inspiring. Without having to think about it, it just makes you feel good. Whereas if you live in a new built place that has no storage, it's got pokey little windows, the whole raison d'etre for building the houses is to make a profit, a financial profit, and is not to give a profit to the people who are living there, which is a profit for better life and feeling and etc. etc.
I think it's a very English kind of tradition of things to design these houses. Those are really kind of poor, like architectural design. I mean, when I compare it to Holland and architectural design there, I mean, even the level of social housing design is on a much higher level.
Yeah,
Is
exactly.
it an English thing, like anti-modernist?
Yes, there's, in a way, but I think it's changing slightly. But
Does it say something about Englishness, about narrow-mindedness?
it is. I think it is a sort of Englishness, and it's an Englishness to do with production methods and building regulations. And a lack of exposure by developers to more contemporary thinking about design, and it doesn't have to be brutalist or hard edged. It can be in the local manner, and it can reflect on what's been there before. But the way it's put together it's to do with profit. And the profit has to be made. People have to make a living, but it doesn't have to be at the expense of good design.
No.
And I mean, I think in the past, in some, good design has existed for quite a long time. In centuries, but not for poor people, which it I think design at every level, from council housing, some council housing, and as you say, social housing in Europe and Scandinavia is fantastic, and it's for people. It's not for the developers in that sense. Yes, rabbit hutches.
Yes.